to this computer so I can edit it later. And I am going to go ahead and this is getting edited out, by the way. Anyway, so my name is Berrien County. I am the executive director of the Berrien County Historical Association. We are located in Berrien Springs, down here in the corner of the state. And we are super excited to have Dirk Hughes join us today because we are always hoping to create lectures and talks that are related to existing topics that we're exploring in our temporary exhibits here at the museum. And thanks to the 6 lodges here in Berrien County, as well as the museum in Grand Rapids, we have a fantastic Masonic exhibit going on. And nobody please correct me again with the whole Masonic versus Masonic. I am from Chicago. My A's, we are hard. We thoroughly enjoy working with different topics and subjects here at the museum. And the 6 lodges came out when we asked, hey, we want to do this exhibit. We only have a few items, and they answered the call wonderfully. So Historic Rituals, the Freemasons of Berrien County, will run inside the sheriff's residence through March 7th. And then within a couple weeks, I usually get that up a little bit faster, we will have a online version of the exhibit that you can explore. So pictures from the full exhibit, we'll have the photos that are there that we'll scan those and put them in. You can read the interpretation. You can join the debate whether or not Berrien County has a 9th Master Mason, Grand Master. I say there is. Berrien County is not yet confirming that they want that 9th Grand Master, but I will give it to them. So we have wonderful items that were donated to us, and we can't wait to share that with you if you cannot make it out. For those of you who are not aware of our organization, we have been around since 1968, and we interpret the history of Berrien County. So we're very excited that this is one area that we are able to explore in our exhibits. Just a couple of announcements regarding our upcoming programs. Later this month, we will have our first of our American Justice Lecture Series. It will also be via Zoom. You can go to our website, berrienhistory.org, to get the link. Dr. Sally Haddon from Western Michigan University is going to explain how American law works and how it's different from common law countries like the UK. And this will set the stage for our exploration of how law has played a role in social justice movements with our next 3 lectures throughout the rest of the year. In the coming weeks, we will also have, right after that will be our next TNC talk, and that will be Dora Whitney, Lady Lawyer. Carrie Charlo of the Michigan Bar Association will be giving that lecture. That will be exactly 1 month from today, same time, 6:30, same place, via Zoom. And if you are interested in learning more about our programs, you can always join our mailing list, visit berrienhistory.org, or you can shoot me an email at info@berrienhistory.org, and we are happy to put you on our mailing list to see all sorts of exciting things that we're doing. So Dirk, I think it's time for you to take it away. And we are very excited that Dirk Hughes is the director of the Michigan Masonic and Museum and Library in Grand Rapids. And he has been very generous with his time and knowledge for the exhibit. And we're very excited that today he's going to talk about the Prince Hall Masons. In honor of Black History Month, we decided to explore the largest fraternal group for African Americans in the United States, with over 300,000 members strong. So we'll explore history and all the important things about being a Prince Hall Mason. So I'm going to give it to you, Dirk, and let you go ahead and tell us the story and history.
It's my show now. Is that what's happening?
It's your show.
Thanks, Rhiannon. I appreciate it. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and just start sharing the screen right now, and we'll kind of take it from there. Let me know if this is the way it's supposed to be. Ta-da. All right. Well, today, as Rhiannon said, we're going to be talking about the Free and Accepted Masons, the Prince Hall affiliation. I think for the courtesy of anybody that might be on this call or watch this later, just a real quick screen on what the Freemasons are, who the Freemasons are, in case you don't know. Just think of the Freemasons as the world's oldest and largest fraternity that teaches a learning system designed to build character. And they do that that learning system uses rituals, ceremonies, symbols, and allegory to convey the lessons that we provide. We think that we came from the old stone Masonic or stonemason guilds of medieval Europe. We're not absolutely sure about that, because prior to 1717, we were a secret society. We're not a secret society anymore. You can see our emblems and our lodges are usually quite prevalent within communities. If you have a Masonic lodge, you can usually see it usually right downtown with a big square and compass on it. But prior to 1717, we were thought of as a secret society, and we kind of count modern Freemasonry, or what we call speculative Freemasonry. The guys that actually work in stone are the operative stonemasons. We are the fraternity that we call speculative Freemasonry, that use the architectural and building tools to symbolically build cathedrals of character instead of the old school building cathedrals of stone. So that's kind of what the Freemasons are. It's a fraternity that is teaching each other how to be better citizens, how to be better leaders, and how to be better people. So that's my little spiel on Freemasonry in general, if you didn't already know. Now, the Prince Hall affiliation is an interesting aspect of Freemasonry, and what we generally call, or what has been generally called, African American or Black Freemasonry. And it's kind of unique to the United States, because it doesn't seem like many other countries had a need for Black Freemasonry, and it's probably because of our racial history, the slavery issue that we had. And so as we go forward, we can kind of think of Prince Hall as Black Freemasonry, although you don't have to be a Black person to be a Prince Hall Freemason. They just like the regular state Grand Lodges, there is no systematic requirement of race within that. It all depends on where a brother feels comfortable, where they join, why they join. But we'll talk a little bit more about Prince Hall as we go through. Now, some of the source books, I need to do a disclaimer that by no means am I an expert on Prince Hall Freemasonry. There's a lot of other brothers and other Prince Hall brothers that are much more knowledgeable in this subject than I am. However, as the director of the Michigan Masonic Museum and Library, it becomes my duty as well, my pleasure, to at least try to enlighten anybody on this. I learn more about this subject and these topics as I research to present them to other people. But the main resource, or the main source books that I used for this presentation are The Official History of Freemasonry Among the Colored People of North America by William Grimshaw from 1903. And one of the reasons I even use this book is it's kind of a landmark book, as one of the earliest what we'll call so-called academic approaches to the Prince Hall affiliation. Now, since this book was published, it has been generally criticized for inaccuracies. So that's something that we want to keep very close attention to. But there's still some good information in there, but there's also some bad information. But for quite some time, this was about the only book that was out there on Prince Hall Freemasonry. Another book that I used was The Negro Masonry in the United States by Harold Van Buren Voorhees. It's 1940s, it's stepping it up a little bit. There's still some inaccuracies. Prince Hall Freemasonry, Prince Hall affiliation, the State Grand Lodge Freemasonry. We do our best to try to get as much accurate information as possible, but just like any kind of academic subject, you're going to find out new information as you go through. Black Square and Compass is another one, 200 Years of Prince Hall Freemasonry by Joseph Wachs. 1979 is bringing us a little closer. And then a documentary account of Prince Hall and other Black fraternal orders. This was done by the Missouri Lodge of Research in 1982. But we have to take into consideration that information was written about. It was written by a state Grand Lodge of Missouri's Lodge of Research. And this was prior to Prince Hall affiliation being recognized by really any of the other state Grand Lodges. So there's probably some bias in the information in that regard as well. So those are the sources that I used. As far as the books in the museum and library, I also pulled some information from some Prince Hall internet sources. The Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Prince Hall in Massachusetts is a really good one. It's one of the earlier Prince Hall Grand Lodges out there. So with that being said, Prince Hall, where does the name come from? Why is it called Prince Hall? And the reason it's called Prince Hall affiliation is because it's named after Most Worshipful Brother Prince Hall. First name Prince, last name Hall. We generally thought of as the father of Black Freemasonry. He was a free Black Bostonian, and depending on what source you're using, his birth date was either 1735 or 1748. But it's it's agreed on by consensus that he was from Barbados. Now, we don't know whether he got his last name from being a servant of William Hall down there in Barbados, or whether he was actually the freeborn son of William Hall in Barbados. But that's where Prince Hall got his last name, was from William Hall. At some point, he did move up to Boston, became a very respected abolitionist. He was literate, self-taught, knew how to read and write. And there's, according to Grimshaw and some other sources, we don't know if this is folklore or not, but I think there's some documentation as possible accuracy that he was a very respected American patriot. And some people believe that he might have been fighting at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. Now, there was 6 different people by the name of Prince Hall on record as being part of that battle. So even though it might sound a little unique to us, Prince Hall was probably a little bit more common name back in the colonial times. So he was a very we'll satisfy ourselves that he was a respected Bostonian. Now, in colonial Boston, Prince Hall was very active. He was working in leather at the time, but he also knew that the Freemasons were in the area, and the Freemasons were very devoted to liberty, equality, and peace. And I think that's what drew him to the idea of becoming a Freemason. That's one of the reasons the Freemasons really did get rooted and nurtured within colonial America, is because the colonial Americans were really experimenting with this idea of equality, and this kind of, the whole reason the Revolutionary War happened was the idea that people thought other people were equal, and they wanted to shed themselves of the yoke of the monarchy. Now, while he was in Boston, Prince Hall and a group of 14 other African Americans, technically at the time they were African colonials, petitioned St. John's Lodge in Boston, a Masonic lodge in Boston that was actually the oldest duly constituted lodge in the Americas. It was constituted, which means it's got it chartered, and it was able to work officially and legally under the fraternal guidelines in 1733. So it was a very well-established Masonic lodge in Boston. But for one reason or the other, the petitions were declined. And we can only suspect that it was because they were Black. That was probably the reason that they got declined, was because of their race. So Prince Hall understood that he wasn't the only one that was having problems. He gathered those 14 other Black colonials together, and they were finally successful at being initiated into the fraternity in March of 1775. To this day, they're known as the Immortal 15. The Prince Hall brothers, our Prince Hall brothers, refer to them as the Immortal 15 because they are the first Black men to be initiated into the Masonic fraternity in the American colonies. Now, even though the Brothers of St. John's Lodge might have had problems with their race, the Irish brothers that were in Boston at the time, we have to remember this is prior to the Declaration of Independence. So we were still a British colony. And there was an Irish military lodge stationed in Boston. They were attached to the 38th Foot Regiment of the British forces there. And that was lodge number 441. And they had no problem with the race of the brothers at all. So they initiated those 15 Black colonials, and they became the first Black Freemasons in the colonial Americas. Now, of course, the challenges with the colonials trying to be self-ruling, shed themselves of the authority of the monarchy. Boston, mid-1770s Boston was kind of a hotbed. There's all sorts of wonderful things going on. I say wonderful sarcastically. There was a lot of conflicts happening. The things were stepping up. Basically, for the decade prior to the Declaration of Independence, there was struggles between the colonials and the British. So in 1776, this is prior to the Declaration of Independence, it got dangerous to be part of the British regiments in Boston. So they left in 1776. That Lodge 441, Prince Hall and the other 14 members' lodge, left Boston. So they left them without a lodge to affiliate with. And so the Prince Hall brothers, those Immortal 15, decided, they were granted a charter or a permit by that 441 lodge that left to allow them to continue performing what we call Masonic work. And Masonic work would be the teachings of the symbols, the performance of the rituals, the ceremonies that are tied to building buildings, funerals, parades, but their powers to act Masonically were limited. They could practice Masonic funerals, they could do Masonic processions, but they couldn't do something very important for the health of a lodge. They couldn't confer degrees, which means they couldn't create new Freemasons and grow their lodge. So they were kind of in a stasis for quite some time. They had that very limited authority. They used it, but they didn't grow for quite some time. However, eventually, not too long after that, if you don't call 10 years too long or so, they were able to form African Lodge number 1. And how they did this was they petitioned the actual Grand Lodge of England, which is thought of the mother lodge of basically all lodges in the world. Because remember what I said, that in 1717, with the formation of the Grand Lodge of England, we kind of count the beginning of modern Freemasonry, our philosophical fraternity. So that charter was granted by the Grand Lodge of England to Prince Hall and his brothers to form African Lodge number 1. The petition was granted over in England in 1784, but we know that travel communication is limited. So it took quite some time for that actual charter to make it back to the States by this time. And it was delivered to Prince Hall and his brothers April 29th of 1787. And so they organized African Lodge number 1 under the Grand Lodge of England, May 6th of 1787, which became African Lodge 459 under the charters or the charter rosters of the Grand Lodge of England. The numbers on a lodge kind of designates how it's associated within that Masonic jurisdiction. And usually it's how often, like when they are chartered. So for example, usually the lower numbers that are on a lodge on a lodge title is the earlier lodges will have lower numbers. So like in Michigan, we have Zion Lodge number 1. That was the first lodge in the state of Michigan. And so 459 shows us that African Lodge 459 was probably around the 459th lodge to be chartered by the Grand Lodge of England. That's a picture of the actual charter that was sent over. That charter has been damaged in fire. That charter still exists at the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Massachusetts. And they usually create replicas to be disseminated through the different Prince Hall Grand Lodges as more like a commemorative piece. But the original one is still in Massachusetts. In June 24th of 1791, only a couple of years after they became African Lodge number 459, Prince Hall was made the first Black provincial Grand Master of the Provincial Grand Lodge within the Grand Lodge jurisdiction of England. Now, it was formed according to Grimshaw, so we know that's a suspect. It was formed in Mason's Hall on Water Street in Boston. And according to the notes or the minutes of that meeting, it was assembly of the craft for the purpose of forming a Grand Lodge. And Brother Prince Hall, was installed as the first Grand Master with the help of officers of St. Andrew's Lodge, which was actually, at the time, traditional Boston lodge that helped him be installed. There's a specific ceremony that we do called an installation of officers, and you can't be an officer unless you have this ceremony performed and you participate in it. In effect, what we had at this juncture was the African Grand Lodge was becoming a provincial Grand Lodge of England under the Mother Lodge of Grand England. So Most Worshipful Brother Prince Hall was made Provincial Grand Master in 1791 by the Prince of Wales. Now, it's been very common since the mid-1700s for the royal family in England to be members of the fraternal order. And it's still to this day, I believe it's the Duke of York, who is usually the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England. At the time, the Prince of Wales was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England. And he's the one that deputized or appointed Brother Prince Hall as the Grand Provincial Grand Master for that African Grand Lodge in Boston. Now, there was a few years that passed and the Prince Hall brothers they weren't Prince Hall yet, they were the African Grand Lodge. And they had a growing presence, very popular. They were usually upstanding citizens. They were men that were trying to make themselves better, trying to make themselves better citizens. So they were very attractive to people that were trying to look for something bigger than themselves to integrate into the community, to help them become better providers and participants in the community. A lot of different reasons why people might join Freemasonry, but the Prince Hall the African Lodge brothers saw a lot of growth during those years, and it actually had that original African Grand Lodge 459 in Boston, also chartered another African Lodge 459 in Philadelphia in 1797. And then we see another presence growing from that, because the original Grand Lodge is the one that charters these other lodges, Hiram Lodge number 3 in Providence, Rhode Island in 1797. So they're starting to get some growth. They're starting to get some traction. Unfortunately, in 1807, Most Worshipful Brother Prince Hall, and we say Most Worshipful Brother because that's how we refer to our Grand Masters or our past Grand Masters. Once you become, Freemasons call each other brothers. Once you become the master of a lodge, you become a worshipful brother. And once you become a grand master of a jurisdiction, you become a most worshipful brother. So that's why we refer to Most Worshipful Brother Prince Hall as Most Worshipful Brother Prince Hall. Depending on the source, he died in December 7th of 1807. This is the photograph you see on the left is the actual tombstone in the cemetery where he is buried in Boston. And then the picture to the right is more of a memorial ceremonial stone that was put up sometime later to commemorate his life. Now, when did the name actually change from African Lodge to Prince Hall Lodge? Well, depending on the source, we don't know. But we've got some idea that's a little bit more accurate. Now, according to Grimshaw, the highly suspect Grimshaw, he says that it happened in 1808, shortly after Prince Hall died. More sources that are a little bit more credible state that it wasn't until 1847. So we're just going to count it as 1808 that the African Lodge brothers decided to change their name to Prince Hall, and we'll talk a little bit more about when it actually switched over to Prince Hall Grand Lodge. Prince Hall dies in December of 1807. Again, you see a different date there because that's from a different source. Now, what happened was when you form a Grand Lodge, you have to have 3 lodges get together to form a new jurisdiction. And you have to do it under really strict recognition from existing Grand Lodges. Now, 3 African lodges met in New York City to form this Grand Lodge of Prince Hall Freemasons or African Freemasons. For the purpose of paying tribute to Worshipful Brother Prince Hall, according to Grimshaw, they changed their name to Prince Hall. And the creation of African Grand Lodge number 1 occurred in 1808. They had 3 lodges get together and form that. For example, the Grand Lodge of Michigan Freemasons was formed in 1826 by a number of different smaller lodges, a couple of Detroit lodges, and actually a Green Bay, Wisconsin lodge, because at the time, Wisconsin was part of the Michigan Territory. Now, this is just, I leave this slide in here to give you an example of how the Grimshaw book is suspect. That we got to be really careful, even when we are reading something of academic value, it might not have as much academic value. We always have to check our sources. Critical thinking demands that we check our sources, and we check those from multiple sources. Now, one of the things that Grimshaw has in his book is the second Grand Master of the African Prince Hall of the African Lodge, after Prince Hall died, was a brother by the name of Nero Prince. It's pretty well documented that Nero Prince is the second Grand Master of the African Grand Lodge. However, according to Grimshaw, Nero Prince was a Russian Jew. He was from Russia. He was from a Jewish family, which leads us to believe that he may have even been Caucasian. So like I said, there is no systematic requirement for what race you are in any of our Grand Lodges, but that doesn't mean that certain races can't get in. One of the reasons the Prince Hall brothers had to form their own lodge is because to get in a membership into a Masonic lodge, it has to be a unanimous decision by all brothers to allow that person to become a member. So the lodge itself might not have any prejudice, but there might be one member within it that does. And so that's why it's such a long and evolutionary change to get different people in lodges. For example, I think the lodges of Michigan and the state Grand Lodges are doing a really good job. I think they reflect their community nowadays. I think any organization should reflect the demographics of its community. So when you see a mixture, if you've got 20% African Americans in your community, your lodge should be 20% African American, and so forth, whatever the percentages are. But if you have one person in there that has any kind of racial, religious, political prejudice, they pretty much have a veto vote on who comes in. So, but this is just an example how Grimshaw says that the second Grand Master of Prince Hall was a Jewish man from Russia. And he served as Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge between 1807 and 1809. He eventually returned to Russia. And according to Grimshaw, he was very instrumental in the defense of Moscow against Napoleon in 1812. Now, we really don't know how much of that is true, but the big thing about the Grimshaw book is that the picture that he uses for Neo Prince isn't even of Neo Prince. It's actually of a Caucasian brother by the name of Brother Thomas Smith Webb, who is instrumental in writing some of the rituals that we use now as Freemasons. So we already know that the picture is wrong. So how much of the other story can we agree with as well? We know that his name was Neo Prince. We don't know where he came from or who he was really. Now, in 1808, we have something that we like to call the Declaration of Independence Masonic style. This is when the formation of African Grand Lodge number 1 decided to create its own autonomy. Now, most lodges are under the authority of a Grand Lodge. Some Grand Lodges or provincial Grand Lodges are under the authority of an established Grand Lodge. So, for example, the Provincial African Grand Lodge is under the authority of the Grand Lodge of England. In 1808, the African Grand Lodge number 1 broke away from any kind of superior authority, and they separated from the Grand Lodge of England at that time. That didn't change the fact that they were chartered by them. It just means that from now on, we're not going to report to you. We are going to be the highest law in the land for our jurisdiction. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole intricacies of the merger of the ancients and the moderns. Just know that when the Grand Lodge of England formed in 1717, that's the original Grand Lodge, and we call them the moderns. The moderns were the older of the Grand Lodges. A number of people within England thought that the rituals and ceremonies that the Grand Lodge was using weren't old enough. They weren't the originals. So they called themselves the ancients, even though they were the younger Grand Lodge. This caused a big schism. So there's multiple Grand Lodges chartering any number of different lodges within that area, jurisdiction. And it happened for almost 100 years. They had multiple Grand Lodges. Well, in 1813, those two different groups finally combined into what we call the United Grand Lodge of England. And what happened was, when they did those unifications, some of those African lodges and African Grand Lodges were formed by one or the other. But when the United Grand Lodge of England merged to become the United Grand Lodge of England, some of those lodges that had been chartered by either the ancients or the moderns fell off the register. So this is one of the reasons that the state Grand Lodges used against the African or Prince Hall lodges in order to call them irregular. Now, irregular simply means they're doing something that doesn't cooperate with the landmarks of Freemasonry. There's certain landmarks in Freemasonry to be a regular lodge. We are currently male only. You have to have a belief in a supreme being. We are not a religion by any means, but we have a religious component. You have to believe in a supreme being to be a Freemason under the regular basis. And there's some other things as well. But if you're not regular, you're not recognized by other Grand Lodges. Freemasonry, even though there's different jurisdictions, it has the ability to travel around the world and visit other lodges as long as your jurisdiction's recognized by another one. So I can go over to the Grand Lodge of Japan and go to one of their lodge meetings because their jurisdiction recognizes ours and our jurisdiction recognizes them. But one of the problems was the African Grand Lodge at the time was omitted from that register from the Grand Lodge of England. And so a lot of the lodges that weren't omitted felt that made them irregular and wouldn't allow inter-lodge visitation between the fraternal brothers. So that's one of the reasons we even talk about this moment, is because it was kind of been working against the Prince Hall brothers for a long time. And it might have been a mass rationalization, as far as we know, where the state Grand Lodges wouldn't have to admit that they have racist members within their lodges. So they kind of blamed it on this irregularity. In 1827, they declared their independence from the United Grand Lodge of England, and they declared their independence from other U.S. Grand Lodges. 1827 was just after the Grand Lodge of Michigan was formed, but there was Grand Lodge of New York, Grand Lodge of Ohio. A lot of different Grand Lodges were already active at the time. They established themselves as a completely separate Masonic body. About 20 years later, those Prince Hall lodges, those Prince Hall Grand Lodges of the different jurisdictions. So you can, like, we have a Grand Lodge of Michigan, we have a Grand Lodge of Ohio, we have a Grand Lodge of New York. There's also the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodges of Michigan, Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodges of Ohio, Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodges of New York. So they run parallel in structure to the state Grand Lodges. But what they did in 1847 is they got together and decided to create this new National Grand Lodge, which really doesn't exist in the Grand Lodge system. There is no capital of Freemasonry worldwide. There is no central authority. Each jurisdiction takes care of itself. Well, this was an experiment by the Prince Hall brothers to create a centralized governing body for Prince Hall Freemasonry. It was called the National Grand Lodge, or what some brothers call the National Compact in Prince Hall Freemasonry. And during that time, it had a lot of benefits. It also caused some problems because a lot of brothers like to remain autonomous. They struggle and they resist against authority a lot of times, and they want to be able to make their own decisions. And if they don't have to report to somebody other than their own authority, that's sometimes a good thing. Basically all the Prince Hall Grand Lodges traced their lineage to that original African Lodge 459. That's what they had in common. So you have the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts traces its lineage to that original Grand Lodge 459 when that charter came over from the Grand Lodge of England. The first independent African Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, a completely different Grand Lodge with different presidents, shall we say. They're called Grand Masters. The Hiram Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, a completely different officer structure, but they tried to work together to allow their members to visit each other's lodges, and they're all Freemasons. It just depends on whether they recognize each other or not. Under that National Grand Lodge, they actually created new warrants for different Grand Lodges. As you can see, this whole list is when the National Grand Lodge created other Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodges, one in Massachusetts, the one in Ohio, which the Michigan brothers at the time were kind of branched off of this Ohio Grand Lodge. The Ontario, Canada, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, North Carolina, Mississippi, these all were created or given charters by that National Grand Lodge of Prince Hall. Now there was a schism. The Prince Hall affiliated brothers, they decided that the compact wasn't working out. So they kind of broke off into a more traditional Grand Lodge structure where each jurisdiction takes care of itself. They work in what we call amity together, or in recognition of each other. So the Prince Hall guys from Michigan can go visit the Prince Hall guys from Ohio. You can go to their meetings, they can come to your meetings and whatnot. So they had more of an established state Grand Lodge structure. Now there are some Prince Hall lodges that never went that direction, and they're called Prince Hall Origin. They're still tied to that old National Grand Lodge Compact. We don't see them much anymore. They still do exist, but just to kind of point it out, that if you run into a PHA, a Prince Hall affiliated member, and a PHO, Prince Hall Origin member, they're not part of the same jurisdiction, and they don't recognize each other, and they can't visit each other's lodges. So that's a difference that I wanted to make sure that was pointed out. And that schism still exists. They haven't united like the Grand Lodge of United England. They still exist. Now, because we have different sources and we have different information from these sources, just for the sake of ease and the sake of conversation, we're just going to kind of establish these landmark dates as the Prince Hall history. So 1775, we kind of count that as the beginning of Black Freemasonry or African American Freemasonry, when Prince Hall and those other 14 brothers, the Immortal 15, were initiated into Freemasonry by that Irish lodge. In 1776, only about a year later, when that Irish lodge left Boston, we're going to count that as the first time they established African Lodge number 1. But remember, they were still very restricted as to what they could do. They really couldn't grow. Now in 1784, that's really a big date in Prince Hall history, because that's the date that they got that charter from the Grand Lodge of England to become real flourishing lodges in the Americas. So 1784 is when we have African Lodge number 459 under the Grand Lodge of England occur, and that's when the Prince Hall guys could really start growing their membership. 1808 is when we see the African Grand Lodge of number 1, and when they're kind of breaking away from the other Grand Lodges. And then in 1847, we're going to count this as the year that they changed their name to Prince Hall Grand Lodge in honor of their first Grand Master, most worshipful brother, Prince Hall. So Prince Hall affiliation comes to Michigan in 1865, and that's not really a completely accurate statement. This is when the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Michigan was formed. There's Prince Hall brothers in Michigan prior to that date, working Masonic lodges, working Masonic work, creating, having meetings, doing the ceremonies. They existed well before that. However, they officially formed a Grand Lodge in 1865. Prior to that, they were affiliated with Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio. Now, we want to make sure that we mention that not everything that looks Masonic is Masonic. There are certain parts of Freemasonry that when you think of Freemasonry, everybody thinks of the square and compasses. That's our emblem. Most people wear them as rings. We see them on buildings. We don't have a copyright on that, though. And so basically anybody can put that on their shirt, and to say that they're a Freemason, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do. We Freemasons, as part of the Prince Hall Grand Lodges and part of the state Grand Lodges, we are under a certain authority. We're regulated very strictly by what we can and what we can't do. So we are the ones that count ourselves as the traditional Freemasons. When people think of Freemasons, they're probably thinking of us. But there's other organizations out there that have kind of absconded with the symbolism, and they've branched off from different areas. For example, the image on the left you'll see is a square and compasses with a key under it, and that's the International Freemasons. They are not recognized Freemasons by the Grand Lodges, whether you're state Grand Lodges or Prince Hall Grand Lodges. And most of those, what we call beware of the bogus, it's kind of a harsh term for the organizations that can't qualify for nonprofit status. They have to incorporate and become structured, and they usually have some kind of money-making structure regarding to that. The Prince Hall Grand Lodges, the state Grand Lodges are nonprofit organizations, and they work that way structurally, and they work that way through the taxes and stuff like that as well. Most of the irregular or bogus lodges that you see around these days were kind of branched off of a schism when when John G. Jones, who was an actual recognized Prince Hall Freemason under the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Illinois, branched off and started creating other Masons, forming other lodges illegally. He didn't have the authority to do it from his Grand Lodge. He did that in 1904, and those fractured, or those like tentacles of Freemasonry are still in existence today. A lot of these brothers who are not part of recognized lodges don't even know that their lodges aren't recognized. They just kind of think their father was one, they are one. And so it is an issue that we as recognized Freemasons have to contend with. And one of the big reasons is because they don't have the same regulations we have. When you usually see something weird happening in the media by someone wearing Masonic regalia, it's most likely a clandestine Mason that doesn't have a Grand Lodge regulating what they do. So just be aware that not every time you see a square and compass is it a recognized Masonic lodge. However, Prince Hall affiliation is recognized, and they are brothers. And we, over the course of time, have developed strong relationships with our Prince Hall brothers. Now, you will notice they're still very proud of their African-American heritage. So most Prince Hall lodges are going to be purely Black or African-American, but I've seen white Prince Hall Masons. And it really depends on the lodge accepting the brother for the character of him instead of his race. But the Prince Hall guys are still very proud of their Black heritage. So most Prince Hall lodges are still primarily Black in membership. An appendant body in Freemasonry, for those of you who don't know, is an actual organization that's affiliated or connected to Freemasonry. You have to be a Master Mason. Master Mason is the full membership in Freemasonry. Masonry has the lodges have 3 primary degrees that are where you're introduced to the new symbols of Freemasonry. You're initiated as an entered apprentice, you're passed to the degree of fellowcraft, and you're raised to the degree of Master Mason. So once you become a Master Mason, you get all the rights and benefits of being a full member, which means, number one, you have to start paying dues. So it's going to cost you some money. Annual dues fluctuate differently from lodge to lodge, depending on what their operating costs are, usually is what the due structure is based on. But after you become a Master Mason, you can join any number of what we call appendant bodies. Masonic organizations that require you to be a Master Mason to join. Some of those are very visible. You might see some of the brothers down on the bottom right. Those are Shriners. Shriners are probably our most visible appendant body. They're the ones that raise the money for the Shriners hospitals. They're the guys in the funny little cars that drive in the parades. All Shriners are Freemasons. You have to be a Master Mason to be a Shriner. Some of the Royal Arch Masons, some of the brothers down on the bottom right are what we call Scottish Rite Freemasons. If you've ever heard of a 33rd degree Freemason, that's only in the Scottish Rite. So if somebody says they're a 33rd degree Freemason, that means they are a Scottish Rite Freemason. There's only 3 degrees in the lodge system. And without getting too bogged down with information, we think Masonically, we think of the 3rd degree as the highest possible degree you could achieve. We're all about equality and meeting on the level. So even if you're a 33rd degree, that doesn't mean you're higher than a 3rd degree. It just means you've seen more degrees, you're a little bit more educated as a Freemason, you've seen more ceremonies, and you're kind of rounding out your Masonic education. But the highest degree in Freemasonry is the 3rd degree. But the Prince Hall guys have all the same appendant bodies as the state Grand Lodges do. The Shriners, the Royal Arch, the brothers you see in red, the Scottish Rite, the brothers you see with the purple and the white hats. The emblem on the top left is for what we call the Order of the Eastern Star. Masonically, this is the organizations that it's designed for women. And the women are the ones that run the show. That organization has been around since 1850. That emblem has been designed since 1850. And there's a whole different presentation I can give on that emblem, but we won't go there now. The emblem is actually supposed to represent the star in the east that was calling the Magi to the birth of the Messiah. And all of the colored points around that star represent different heroines from the Bible. So the Eastern Star is a very biblically based Masonic organization. You don't have to have a certain religion, but that doesn't mean that we don't pull ideas from different religions. So there's some famous PHA brothers, and they really do cover the gambit of where they're coming from: government, law, education, activism, entertainment, sports. There was no way for me to put everybody's name down on here, but some of the names might surprise you a little bit. The president of South Africa, the first Black president of South Africa, Brother Nelson Mandela, was a Prince Hall brother. In law, long time and very respected Supreme jurist. He was on the Supreme Court, Brother Thurgood Marshall. Under education, Brother Booker T. Washington. And there's so many others. I'm just trying to pick a few. Activism, a lot of the activists in the civil rights movement, including recently departed John Lewis, was a Prince Hall brother. But Medgar Evers, one of the earlier losses of the civil rights movement, was a Prince Hall brother as well. In entertainment, we've got Ossie Davis. He passed away not too long ago. As far as acting, you can see Brother Richard Pryor down there, comedian. Sports, Sugar Ray Robinson, Willie Mays. I mean, any number of different areas. The overall I think, binding thing that we see with these brothers are the fact that they usually have some kind of leadership capacity, either in the community or in their careers. They are usually the ones that are on the forefront and really making things happen. Some of the more recent ones, this is one that we get a kick out of, is Shaquille O'Neal. Brother Shaquille O'Neal is a Prince Hall brother. He was actually, when he first was raised as a Master Mason by a lodge out by New York, and I can't remember if it was New York or New Jersey. I apologize, but he was called out on live TV by some of his sportscasting friends, like, "Hey, what's that ring you got on your hand?" And he showed his Masonic ring that he had received upon becoming a Master Mason, and he said that was the ring of his profession. And what he meant by that was, we in the Freemasons call the work we do, call that character building, leadership learning work, we call it the craft. It's actually like we're working on ourselves. And so that's his ring of my profession. Wasn't that was the ring of his basketball profession, it was the ring of his Masonic profession. On the left, we can see Brother Richard Pryor, and that hat he's wearing is his Scottish Rite hat. So we know he was also a Scottish Rite member. No, I'm proud and slightly ashamed to show this slide. The blue Grand Lodges are the Grand Lodges that have recognized Prince Hall affiliation as regular, recognized Freemasonry, and they can visit each other and travel with each other. The Grand Lodge of Michigan has recognized our Prince Hall brothers. Here in the Grand Rapids Masonic Temple, we actually have a Prince Hall Lodge meeting here, and we help each other out with degree work. We go visit each other. But there are still some states in the Union that have not recognized Prince Hall Freemasonry as regular Freemasonry. So you can't be a Prince Hall Freemasonry in Tennessee, for example, and go visit a lodge that's under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Tennessee. Now, hopefully this will change. I don't want to make an assumption, but as you can tell, most of those states are in the old Confederate states. And so there might be some reason behind some resistance to completely open up to the idea that Prince Hall brothers are as regular brothers as anybody else in the world. But the blue states are the ones that recognize Prince Hall Freemasonry. The yellow states are the ones that do not recognize Prince Hall Freemasonry as regular, legitimate Freemasons. I have a lot of artifacts and regalia and things for the Grand Lodge of Michigan and other state Grand Lodge jurisdictions. This is the only piece of Prince Hall affiliated documentation I have at the Michigan Masonic Museum and Library. And I'm a little ashamed to say that too. I've talked to my Prince Hall brothers and I said, you guys, give me some regalia, give me some stuff that I can put in the museum. And just Masons are kind of resistant to give away their regalia. They don't want to lose it. They don't want somebody abusing it. The Prince Hall brothers have promised me that they're going to give me more artifacts and regalia, and I am going to, once I can get enough, I am going to put up a permanent display commemorating and highlighting and showcasing our Prince Hall affiliated brothers, which I think they deserve. And I think that should be happening soon, hopefully. If you get confused, Prince Hall brothers have a tendency to put Prince Hall on their regalia, on their wardrobes. So you shouldn't have any question of that's a Prince Hall brother or not. They advertise it pretty well. I'm not sure if you can see it, but they'll actually put Prince Hall affiliation. So you know that they're a different jurisdiction. Prince Hall affiliation, the state Grand Lodges work a little bit differently, as far as there can only be one Grand Lodge within a geographical area of a state. So there can't be two Grand Lodges within the state boundaries of Michigan. There can't be two Grand Lodges within the boundaries of the state of Ohio. The Prince Hall affiliated guys are slightly different than that. They can actually overlap an existing state Grand Lodge, but they themselves will not allow multiple Prince Hall Grand Lodges within the state of Michigan. So the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Michigan is the only Prince Hall Grand Lodge that can occur within the state boundaries of Michigan. Our most worshipful Prince Hall brothers in Michigan, their headquarters are in Detroit. This is the photograph of the current Grand Line officers. The Grand officers are basically the administrative group and the ceremonial group that takes care of business in between Grand Lodge annual communications. Grand Lodge actually refers to all the different lodges in a jurisdiction, but it's not effective to take votes and everybody get together. So once a year, every lodge sends a representative to the Grand Lodge annual meeting, and that's when they take care of changing any rules in the ritual, changing any rules in what we call Masonic law, associating with each other, making sure that we're doing our organizational opportunities. So the Grand Lodge officers are the ones that make sure that the Grand Lodge itself administratively works in between those annual communications. The Most Worshipful Honorable Brother Kevin Bell is the Grand Master and of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, Free and Accepted Masons of Michigan at this time. Now, at one point, there was almost 60 different Prince Hall Prince Hall lodges in the state of Michigan. The state lodges, there was almost 500, 600 regular state lodges. And since 1959, the fraternity has decreased in membership. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think the world has changed. I think technology's had something to do with that. I don't think it's a coincidence that our membership started to decline around the same time televisions were introduced into the home. So we are still an active organization. We just don't have the same number of members as we did back in 1959. There are still 35 active Prince Hall lodges within the state of Michigan. At the peak, there was 2 Prince Hall lodges in Berrien County. One was in Benton Harbor. It was called Harbor Lodge number 15. And then the other one was John W. Moore Lodge 42 in Niles, Michigan. That one is still active. That's one of the still active 35 Prince Hall lodges in the state of Michigan at this time. There were a number of different Prince Hall lodges in the surrounding areas. There was one in Covert. There was one in Decatur. Just outside Berrien County, there was probably 3 or 4 lodges within a very short drive of Berrien County. But Berrien County had 2 Prince Hall lodges at the time. One of them is still active. So other than that, that's the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to field any questions or concerns or whatever, but thank you very much for listening, and I appreciate your patience with me.
Okay, I just have to say, I don't know how any of you guys remember half of that stuff. Brian and I were sitting here and he's like, I think I need a flow chart to follow this. And I was like, I know, right?
It can be confusing.
Yeah, and I said, I would have worshipful Grand Master messed it up like 2 hours before this thing even started. So I've got to give you guys a round of applause for remembering so much of that, the titles and the different stages of the titles and all of that. So, oh my God, thank you for having the memory for that. Because
that's part of the learning system, the ritual, the memorization over and over again. We bang it into our brains.
I do want to make a point, the charter for the Prince Hall, that original charter, we do have a copy on display in the exhibit. It was loaned to us by Coloma, I believe. Don, I think, it's from Don's personal collection. Don is a former Boyer. He's a former worshipful Grand Master of the state. Yeah, maybe.
Let me tell you, one of the reasons he probably has that, Don, Most Worshipful Brother Don Boyer was instrumental. He during his year as Grand Master, he was kind of the one that really went out there to try to elicit relationships between the 2 Grand Lodges. And Don was an early proponent of mutual jurisdictional recognition. And so he became really close with the Prince Hall brothers. And I can almost guarantee you they gave him a copy of that charter as like a commemorative thank you or something.
And you're exactly right, Dirk. That's what Don told me. We also have pictures of the meeting between the Michigan Lodge and the Prince Hall affiliate Michigan Lodge. And it was the first time their Grand Masters had met ever in the history of both organizations. And that Don was a Grand Master in 93. So that's 1993, guys. Like, that's how late these relationships were starting to finally become pretty established and formed. one of our guests have a question. Do you have any other information about the Benton Harbor Lodge, such as when they dissolved?
I don't know that, but I think I might have access to trying to get that information. And what we'll do before we sign off, and I don't have a slide of it, but I'll be happy to give you my email address. You can write to me with that question. I'll reach out to, I've got a lot of Prince Hall brothers that I kind of rely on to give me some information. As a matter of fact, knowing how many active lodges in the state right now was provided to me by worshipful brother Harry Weaver, a Prince Hall brother of ours. And so I know the people to reach out to that can probably get that information.
Fantastic. Elaine, who'd asked the question, she's one of our members. We're always so excited when Elaine joins us. She wrote the book, History of St. Joseph and Benton Harbor, and she thinks that there may be a photo of the group at the Benton Harbor Library, which would make sense because they collect the Benton Harbor history. So
there is, it's in Elaine's book.
it is. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, but they have a copy.
Yeah.
But the library has the copy. So if you're looking for the copy to include in your own records, Dirk, check with the library. They have the original copy. I do have a question myself. I don't know if anybody else caught this, but you mentioned very early on, this is way back early, that the list of different lodges that were forming. How was the fact that there was an African lodge, 459, twice, is that because they were in two different states, or how did that, or were they like, was the Philadelphia like an extension of 459? I was a little confused by that.
Yeah, it's a little bit, make sure I got that right. I just posted my email on the chat, by the way.
Yep.
It's kind of what it is. It's chartering, and this is not really anything that happens anymore. But back then, what they were almost doing was cloning their ability to create another lodge. So that Philadelphia 459 was still tied to that charter number 459. Now new lodges will get a completely separate number.
Mm-hmm.
But back then what they were doing is that Boston 459 created a new lodge in Philadelphia. But because they didn't have the power to give it a new number, they gave it 459. And my assumption is by the time the Hiram Lodge in Providence came around, they had that power to give them a different number. So basically they kind of cloned themselves in number, but they still were a completely autonomous lodge with their own officer corps. They probably had their own due structure, but they still, both of those reported directly to the Grand Lodge of England.
Okay, I was just a little confused by it, and I was like, is it because they're different states? But you were talking about how they weren't kind of at that stage yet in their organization. So I just wanted clarification. And I just want to clarify for my own memory, the purple hats that was in the Scottish Rite photo, those were officers, correct? Purple is for officers?
Well, nope. I have to do a disclaimer. Southern Masonic jurisdiction Scottish Rite is slightly different than Northern Masonic jurisdiction Scottish Rite. So I'm going to talk from a Northern Masonic jurisdiction Scottish Rite perspective, because that's what we in Michigan are, Northern Masonic jurisdiction. The purple hats are what we call active members.
Okay.
So an active member is someone who's actually active at a jurisdictional level in what we call the Supreme Council. The Supreme Council is the administrative and authority organization within the Scottish Rite. So those active, when you become a 33rd degree, you get a white hat. When you become a 33rd degree Freemason, you become an honorary member of the Supreme Council, which means you don't have really any kind of authority to go down there and vote. You don't have any kind of say in the decision making other than what you do at the local level. The active members are those 33rds who actively participate in the governance of the jurisdiction. So those purple hats are like the leaders administratively in the Scottish Rite.
Okay. I was just trying to remember.
The Scottish Rite officer hats are gold, are yellow.
Yes, which you loaned one to us for the exhibit, which we appreciate, because Mark Hull, who's one of our folks here, he loaned generously 3 of his hats from the Scottish Rite, but we didn't have that one yet. So thank you for loaning that to us. We appreciate it.
Mark will be able to loan you a white hat pretty soon.
Yes, he will. We're very excited for him. Complete his collection.
So. Yeah, he's collecting hats.
All right. Are there any other questions for Dirk about the Prince Hall affiliate Masons? None?
And Rhiannon, just as a reminder, I did post that email on chat. So if anybody's needing that email, they can get it off chat.
Yes. So it's dhughes@mmcfonline.org. And if you can't remember that or forgot to write it down, email me. I have it because we've been in communication. So I do have that available for you. Well, if there are no additional questions, I have to sit there and extend a huge thank you to you, Dirk. You have been so generous with your time and making this accessible for those who are unfamiliar with Freemasons. I feel like maybe part of the reason why people think you're a secret society is because sometimes from an outsider perspective, it's a lot to keep up with.
Yeah. We do that on purpose, make it difficult to understand us. But really, if you ever want to, I'll talk your ear off. If you ever want to come into the museum and library, I will tell you just about everything you need to know about Freemasonry.
Well, give us just a little bit of information about the library. When are you open? Are you open? Is there admission, and any other information people may want to know?
Yep, I'm located at 233 Fulton Street East, Grand Rapids, Michigan, right on the corner of Lafayette and Fulton. I'm in the lower level of the Grand Rapids Masonic Temple. You can't miss it. I like to call it the lower level instead of the basement, or the garden level instead of the basement. I'm open from Tuesdays through Saturdays. Most of those days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, I'm open to the public free of charge. And we have covered parking here, so even during bad weather, it's not a bad place to park. I'm open those days from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. in the evening. On Thursdays, I'm open from noon until 8 in case you can't get here after work. I stay open at least one day a little bit later. Tonight, for example, I'm here till 8 o'clock to offer people the opportunity to come in. And it's a full lending library. You don't have to be a Freemason to borrow the books. And I will be happy to absolutely tell you more than you could possibly want to ever know about Freemasonry.
I mean, well, that is your job, is to share that history. So that's good that you are very passionate to tell others.
I am very passionate about it. I think it's a cool organization.
It is a cool organization. If you are on Facebook, you can follow the library and see all the things that they post, and historical photos, artifacts, and other stories that they share, very much like we do with the History Center Courthouse Square on Facebook. And if you are interested in visiting us to see our exhibit, Tuesday, we are not open Tuesday through Saturday. We are Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. currently. We do follow COVID rules, so please wear a mask and please limit the number of people in your party so we all can remain safe. And I do need to make sure that if you are looking for an opportunity to have a one-on-one chat with a Freemason brother, on Thursdays from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., Mark Halt has donated his time to answer any question that you may have. So if you can't go get your ear talked off by Dirk, Mark will be more.
Mark will do it too.
You'll see their passion come through. He has given a few kind of tours of the exhibit, as the way we designed it was to look like a Grand Lodge room and then a separate kind of other area. And he is very thorough. You will leave there with more knowledge than you could ever hope to. And we are very grateful for Mark's generosity, for his advice on the exhibit, and of course, for his donation of time these last few weeks. And from what I can gather, he will be doing this until the end of the exhibit run. So we want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And if you did not get to come tonight and you're watching this as an afterthought, meaning we post on our YouTube page, we want to thank you so much. This has been a fun, exciting thing for me. It's a different topic than we've normally talked about here in the BCHA. So I want to extend my thanks to Dirk for his generosity for being here tonight, as well as our 6 lodges here in Berrien County: St. Joseph Lodge, Niles, in Niles, Buchanan, St. Joe in St. Joe, Lakeshore and Benton Harbor, Coloma, and Three Oaks for their donations and support of the exhibit. So, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful evening. Enjoy the end of the week and into the weekend. And with the weather outside, please, please stay warm and safe. You all have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.